all for coming out on the drizzly evening, but you know, coming to the Tales on a Monday night is a lot of fun and a lot of activities. So thank you so much for coming out. My name is Vanessa Mendes, and I'm a Board of Director for the Tales of Cape Cod. It is my privilege to introduce tonight's guest speaker. For those of you who need a list of the remaining lecture series throughout the summer for your entertainment, of course we have them at the front door available for you. Also, you can visit us on our web, www.talesofcapecod.org. Also, in your seating area, there's a yellow index card. If you want to fill one out tonight with some suggestions or special requests, please feel free to fill them out, and you can drop them in the box in the conference room. How many of you are attending tonight for the first time? Well, we have a few, so thank you, welcome. I'm glad you did come out tonight. So just let me tell you a little bit about the Tales of Cape Cod. We are an all-volunteer, nonprofit organization dedicated in preserving and communicating the history of the old Colonial Courthouse in and around. We also maintain the Ayano gravesite, which is in the Cummaquid property area, along with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. This historical building is been built in the 1700s, so 1770 is when we have the documentation on the building. Our guest speaker series has been operating since 1949, thanks to Lou Cataldo, which some of you may have met or had acquaintance with. So we thank him too, now that he's no longer with us. We also conduct reenactments, dramatizations, and events that have occurred around the Colonial Courthouse. Also, feel free to visit us on our web if you'd like to host an event in this wonderful building. I'm sure we can accommodate you, and the application is available on the website. Our sponsor for tonight is Mr. Doug Mitchell, and again, we thank him very much for his support in helping us with our lecture series. Tonight's guest speaker is Michael Welch. Michael Welch is a historian and a school teacher from American history in the Sandwich School Department. He's going to portray Captain Chipman. Michael Welch provides insight on Civil War, military life, the role of Captain Chipman, who has led a militia raised on the Cape. The military engagement of the Sandwich Guards, Company D-29 Regiment. The 29th Regiment, I guess that's how you would say that. 29th Regiment, okay. Seems really important. All the props here has got me really excited to hear what he has for us in store tonight. Also, after the presentation, please do not leave without getting the delicious desserts that Jude Martin has prepared with her good friend Ann. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Michael Welch.
Fort Sumter had capitulated. The gloomy pall of war clouded over us. What choice did we have but to stamp out the evil that befell this land? With a wife and a child at home and another on the way, I had responsibilities, to be sure. But my country called, and I wouldn't shirk my duty while my nation was in peril. I was born December 23rd, 1829. My parents were John Ellis Chipman, and my mother was Celia Bassett. I married Elizabeth Freeman Gibbs, Lizzie, October 17th of 1854. We had 3 children, Grace, Edward, and Sarah. Gracie died when she was less than half a year old, and it was hard on Lizzie and I. Eddie was born at the end of May in 1859. In April of 1861, I was 31, and Lizzie, a few months younger than I, had just discovered that she was with child. It was a very happy time in our lives, and though national politics had taken a turn for the worse, our future in our town, Sandwich, Massachusetts, looked fine indeed. As a young man, I'd been in the Army for a short time. I had worked as a mechanic. I knew how to maintain and build machines for the mills, several of which were operating here in Massachusetts. Sandwich had a fine glass industry, and so I could find work there. Upon my leaving the Army, I returned home, married Lizzie, and found steady work. As national politics looked to become increasingly unsteady, it seemed that an inescapable conflict was upon us. It was just about after John Brown's famous raid at Harper's Ferry in 1859 that men in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts knew something had to be done to prepare for the worst. I helped establish our town's militia company, which we named the Sandwich Guards, in 1860, so before the rebellion. We may not have been more than parade ground soldiers, but we did our part to learn our drill from Ebenezer Stoneman's manual written for Massachusetts militia troops, and we participated in civic events. Having been discharged in 1853 as a sergeant from the regular Army, I had the benefits of strict discipline and thorough military training and military life. My friends and neighbors in our town's militia company elected me then to be captain. And then the rebellion came. Naturally, experienced men were looked to for guidance, and it fell to me to recruit men for the national cause. April 20th, we officially enlisted and reformed our unit, still carrying the name of the Sandwich Guards. We would retain this name and would become Company D, 3rd Massachusetts Volunteer Militia, and then still retain that company designation, Company D, the Sandwich Guards, when we became the 29th Regiment of Massachusetts Volunteers later that year. Our enlistment was not the typical story of men across the Commonwealth, so I mention it here. A bounty was raised for volunteers, and on May 6th, the company was mustered. Prepared to offer our services to the state, we departed to Boston 2 days later. We were surprised upon our arrival to find that there had been a mistake in our paperwork. Our terms of service were for 5 years or for the duration, and the government was expecting us to be on for 3 years. Arriving back at Town Hall the next day, we discussed these changes and resolved our honor to commit. All but one man agreed to serve in this new enlistment. Sunday, May 11th, at town meeting, it was agreed to borrow a generous amount of $4,000 to support families of the men who left behind their families. A week later, on May 18th, 1861, we appeared before Town Hall, and Major Sylvanus Finney, the owner of the Barnstable Patriot, presented us with a beautiful flag. The right arm of Massachusetts, with a motto on it emblazoned, "God speed the right." On the reverse were the arms of the United States. After patriotic speeches and singing from the chorus in town, I gave a few short words accepting the colors from Major Finney and promised to carry these colors in our service against rebeldom. I gave a short remark in which I promised that we would bring these flags and these arms with us to bear against the enemy, and that we would do so until rebeldom was crushed. I handed over the colors to Lieutenant Kearns. It was a glorious ensign, deep as the blue sea. God speed the right, that motto. It encouraged us to go off and do our duty, like men, to stop this rebellion. We were escorted to the railway station by the Sandwich Cornet Band, and nearly the entire town followed in our wake. It was quite a sight to see. In the 3rd week of May, we joined the 3rd Massachusetts Volunteer Militia at Fortress Monroe. Men from the 3rd and the 4th had already gone down there and had participated in a somewhat dubious action of sinking our own ships to block the harbor from rebel pirates, as I would call them, commerce raiders. We held the fort under the command of General Butler, and we did our part to make sure the rebels did not take that very important piece of federal real estate. We stayed in Fortress Monroe for some time and were known as the Massachusetts Battalion until about December 13th of 1861, when by special order 626, Governor John Albion Andrew of Massachusetts reorganized us into the 29th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry. I had been appointed by John Andrew to be major to the regiment, an honor indeed. Deserving men had been commissioned into vacancy and enlisted men promoted where vacancies occurred. And so it is in this part of the organization that I'll tell the rest of my story. We stayed in Newport News, Virginia, until the winter passed and the new campaign season opened in May of 1862. It was a nice little fishing village with surrounding plantations, just on the tip of Hampton Roads. The winter was certainly cold, but milder than any winter I ever remembered here on Cape Cod. We stayed at Newport News, Virginia, until the winter passed and the new campaign season opened in May of 1862. The men were issued the typical federal gear of a Union soldier. The blue fatigue blouse, the workhorse of the Union Army. 4 buttons, wool construction, rugged. A little more flexible than the fine tailored militia outfits we carried with us from Sandwich. With a lack of proper arms, our men were issued Enfield rifle muskets, which were effective weapons, but British in manufacture. They were not American. It was a matter of Yankee pride to carry a Springfield into battle, and we would have to wait our turn until more were available. As I was mentioning, our men had almost a year before the campaign began in 1862 to stay in Fortress Monroe and then in Newport News and to drill and to train. They certainly looked like soldiers. The true test would be marching in the hardships of war. Their arms and accoutrement had been issued by the government, and to make up for the lack of proper equipment, eventually they would be issued proper materials. But we waited, and we waited, and waited, and further waited, until McClellan decided to advance to Richmond. McClellan was infamous for his case of the slows, ever failing to go where he was needed, when he was needed, and so the army continually stagnated. While we were still on station, though, for all the waiting, we did witness something incredible. The sinking of the USS Cumberland in a battle between the Monitor and the Merrimack, so-called. This was the first battle between iron ships. It was quite a thing to see. The Virginia, or the Merrimack, was a rather ugly thing. It looked like an iron barn floating on the water. And the Merrimack was no better. It was than the Monitor as far as its ability to carry heavy firepower and to float. The Monitor looked like a cheese box on a raft. It was quite strange. And so in our stagnation, we at least got to see this interesting conflict between ostensibly what are the first iron vessels in all of history to combat each other. Anyways, we occupied Norfolk and then Portsmouth and stayed there until June. And then we departed for White Horse Landing and finally moved towards Richmond. The late spring and early summer of 1862 opened with high hopes under McClellan. "On to Richmond" was the rallying cry we could hear echoing as we marched in this renewed attempt to besiege and take the enemy's capital. And so we marched, and marched, and marched, and got no closer to the capital. Virginia's climate is pleasant enough, I'll tell you that, but it was less than welcoming on active campaign. Many a soldier would remark the dusty roads. Well, perhaps you and I, ambling alone down a dry Virginia road, might kick up a tiny speck of dust or two. Joined by a friend, we might make a small trail behind us. But march regiment after regiment after regiment, brigade, and a full army, and we would kick up a cloud of dust that could choke a man. It was so thick, after a long leg, we might be covered. We might take on the appearance of rebels, our federal blue coats so gray from the dirt and dust. The people in Virginia were never very fond of us either. They saw us as invaders. And then there were those other inhabitants of Virginia. Snakes and other vermin, be they fleas that could thrive in hell, graybacks or lice creeping, and flying bugs yet unnamed that would beset and chew upon our armies. And then there was the heat and the rain. It always seemed to rain after an artillery barrage. I am no man of science, but I am told it has something to do with the concussive force of our guns. And when it rained, those same dusty roads became quagmires that could swallow an artillery case on up to its hubs, suck horses down on their bellies, and immobilize brigades of men. In spring of 1862, the 29th saw itself join the 2nd Corps in the division under the command of the famed Irishman Thomas Francis Maher. We were in an odd spot, a regiment of old Massachusetts families, Protestant to a man, of stock from sturdy Pilgrim and Puritan. A mustering of names in our regiment would have been familiar on the quarterdeck of the Mayflower or any other ship from the Great Migration. And here we were, thrown into 3 regiments made up of foreign-born Irishmen, Catholics too, from New York of all places. We were not likely to get along. The Irish were jaunty sorts, singing and laughing as they marched into battle, as we were perhaps more reserved, some might even say stoic. Though these were our political foes by nature, our introduction had gone well enough, and our 2 groups discovered the hidden virtues of each other in camp, on the march, and in battle. We fought over 20 pitched battles. Over our long period of service, in fact, some have concluded the 29th may have been in more battles than any other Massachusetts regiment. Regardless, we certainly have seen our share of scrapes. Our story is very much so that of the Army of the Potomac's for much of its service, which is well established, so I will only comment on a few notable engagements of that first year. Our first true test of fire was at Fair Oaks in the 7 days before Richmond. This was a week of hellish fighting from June 25th to July 1st of 1862. Gaines's Mills, Savage's Station, White Oak Swamp, Malvern Hill. Bloody fights, more like a rolling battle over an intense week. We had losses in many of those engagements, so thankfully ours were smaller in number. We occupied a place called Ball's Bluff until August and moved on to Centerville near the old battleground at Manassas Junction. McClellan had been replaced in command by John Pope, his rival, but McClellan still had command of the Army of the Potomac. Stonewall Jackson attacked General Pope, and this terrible defeat that followed may have been a result of General McClellan's delay. Some say by design. McClellan had slowed our line of march to guarantee General Pope's overthrow and perhaps his replacement. Regardless of what happened, with Pope's exit, McClellan was in fact restored to command, and the Army of the Potomac prepared to fight General Lee again. But prepare is all we do. McClellan still saw ghosts, saw enemy where there was none, and overestimated the size of our enemy even in the face of overwhelming intelligence to our advantage. And so July turned to August, August to September, and there was little hope of us ending the campaign. In September, we made our march through Maryland once we learned that Lee had invaded there. And the 2nd Corps, of which we were a part, was engaged near Sharpsburg, September 17th of 1862, at a battle that we now call Antietam. Some say Antietam was not much of a creek and Sharpsburg was not much of a town, but the battle there was terrible. Many have heard of the Sunken Road, now called Bloody Lane. Here, the 29th engaged with such furor and elan that we won praise and regard from General Maher. We fought in the center of our brigade, between the 63rd on our right and the 69th on our left, these New York Irishmen. Our part of the line was somewhat sheltered by a dip in the ground at our position overlooking the road. And nonetheless, the fight was fierce, and the other regiments in the brigade had retired from the field, and we were stuck out there in the line. After what seemed an eternity, we returned to camp that night, only with the sun setting to the killing end that day. Tired and exhausted, all our men wanted to do was rest on their arms and sleep. And General Maher broke into a long speech of praise, calling us unequaled in the army and Irishmen in disguise. While these words from this Irish patriot were, I'm sure, meant to be high praise, they created a bit of a stir in our regiment. And whilst the general speechified, a few unlisted men, unbeknownst to any of us, slipped into his tent, and it was later discovered had made away with the general's bottles of whiskey. We were given a beautiful banner of Tiffany silk portraying the Harp of Ireland and our regiment's number. Colonel Barnes, myself, and the other captains in the regiment felt this was a problematic gift. We were thankful to be regarded so highly by our brothers in arms, but we decided to decline the banner on terms that we were not Irishmen and could not carry it into battle. Such a controversy and tension ensured that it was requested that the 29th Massachusetts, with not an Irishman in it, transfer out of the Irish Brigade. In fact, we were no longer in Maher's brigade. We found ourselves no longer in the 2nd Corps of the Army of the Potomac, and we were placed in an entirely different organization altogether. We have now been transferred to the command of General Burnside's old corps, the 9th. After Antietam, we stayed at Harper's Ferry until the end of October. The Army up to Loudoun Valley and to Falmouth, and by mid-November, we were part of the Battle of Fredericksburg. As we were no longer part of the 2nd Corps, we were thankfully spared the horror of facing the rebel guns on Mary's Heights, where our former brothers in arms, the Irish Brigade, suffered terribly. We did suffer loss nonetheless, and as did nearly all the regiments and units that were part of that battle. It was a terrible day, and with it came a crushing blow. With the new year came our participation in yet another ill-fated operation, known only now today as Burnside's Mud March. An imaginative mind can probably tell why. Our Army commander was replaced by Joe Hooker of Hadley, Massachusetts, and Burnside reverted to his old command over us in the 9th Corps. Burnside and his command were sent out to Newport News once more, and then in March of 1863, the entirety of the 9th Corps was removed for the Army of the Potomac and sent west to Kentucky to battle guerrillas. From Paris, Kentucky, Nicholsville, Lancaster, and Stamford, we changed posts chasing enemy partisans. Well, we never caught Mosby or Quantrill. We kept some semblance of order in the place and tried to keep peace. In May, we moved on to Cairo, Illinois, and joined General Grant's forces outside a place called Vicksburg. We participated there in that siege from June 17th to July 4th. And once that great stronghold on the mighty Mississippi fell, it seemed that rebeldom was cut in half. As news spread of our victory, we also learned of another great boon by our comrades in the Army of the Potomac. There's a place in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. Lee had attacked the North again in Pennsylvania and been driven back, and his invasion was broken. He staggered back to Virginia. Perhaps it would all be over soon. With Vicksburg taken, we moved on to Jackson. And from Jackson, we besieged that city. Having returned the flag to the part of rebeldom, it seemed that Mississippi was finally in our hands. And so we were ordered out to eastern Tennessee. Our new role in life became chasing General Longstreet. Marching in eastern Tennessee was very difficult. We outdistanced our interior lines, and we faced the cold with insufficient clothing, having literally worn our gear out, holed our shoes, and worn out our clothes, wearing them to tatters practically. For the first time we could remember, we faced a lack of food, as unpalatable as salt pork and hardtack are. We could assure its regularity, and now we had neither. But even with those hardships, we never flagged in our duty. We fought at Blue Springs, Campbell's Station, and took Knoxville. We had subdued Tennessee as well. We were finally recalled to the east. Having done our duty out west, we could return to Ohio, and then on train to the capital. Many of the men's terms of service were ending. We had signed on for 3 years in April of 1861. Here we found ourselves in April of 1864. We had to make a decision. With enough men rejoining a regiment, it could be retained and be designated a veteran organization. Slightly higher pay, too. Many men decided, including myself, after great resignation, to re-enlist. And in the now 29th Veteran Volunteers, other men joined us. Those men not rejoining were transferred to the 36th Massachusetts, which was bound for home. Lizzie wrote to me and told me once they arrived in Massachusetts, they were met with great fanfare and celebration. Home. If only I could have returned. I enjoyed a short furlough, but it was too far away. I could never travel back to Sandwich and make it back in time. Back to Lizzie, back to Edward, back to little Sarah. Sarah, who I'd only seen once with my own eyes. Our veteran volunteers rejoined the Army of the Potomac on May 18th of 1864. The 29th Massachusetts Veteran Volunteers had sustained several losses to the enemy and many more to disease. A regiment fights until it bleeds to death. A regiment is a village gone to war. We march beside our brothers and our fathers, and sometimes, depending on our age, with our sons. And each loss is terrible and irreplaceable. And the state does not give us replacements. You can never replace a man, truly. But his space, his number can be, but not in the Federal Army. Through patronage and rewards, deserving officers are promoted into new regiments rather than reinforcing existing regiments. And so the 29th sustained losses and took its toll. We were nearly 1,000 men when we started, and now we were fewer than 400 effectives, including officers. Colonel Barnes was frequently placed in command of the brigade. Our Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, the next man in line was myself, and so often I was placed in command of the regiment in his absence. And it was a great honor to lead such men. And yet the stress of it all was unnerving. These were men that I knew, men that I cared about, and men that I may very well have to order to their deaths. It was no easy task. And each day became longer and harder as we pushed closer and closer to our objective. With a new campaign upon us and Grant making his headquarters in the Army of the Potomac, we marched. But Grant was different. Not incompetent like Burnside, nor was he vain like McClellan, nor arrogant like Joe Hooker, nor angry like Meade. Perhaps he was not particularly learned, but he fought. And this time we advanced, never waning in our resolve, never losing ground, going closer to the enemy. We fought in the Rapidan campaign, Totopotomoy, Cold Harbor, Bethesda Church. We engaged in all these attacks on Lee's army, and like the rest of the Army of the Potomac, we suffered terrible casualties in this new phase of the war that seemed unending, day after day, week after week. Instead of a carefully planned strike, Grant was literally hurling his men at the enemy in what was a meat grinder. But we still advanced, and each time we weakened Lee's army, and we cared not any longer if we captured Richmond, though that would happen too. Grant's goal was to hit Lee and destroy his army of Northern Virginia, and that would ensure our victory. Without Lee, what was keeping rebeldom alive? Before Petersburg, June 17th, 1864, the 29th engaged in what was perhaps one of its most dangerous engagements. It fell to my command that day. The 29th was in my care as Colonel Barnes had brigade command. And as we marched before the city of Petersburg, where Lee had decided to stand and fight, our colors were nearly taken. The colors of a regiment are very important indeed. They are your identity. It is amazing what a man will do to save a flag that has been carried by his brothers, a flag that has been carried over battlefields, under its folds where countless men have been wounded and died, because that flag not only represents your regiment, your home, but our nation. Some argue that perhaps colors are not needed in battle, that they are antiquated. And yet, to a man, we stubbornly decided we would carry our colors into battle. On a vicious assault on June 17, 1864, the enemy's line was charged, and our color bearer was killed, a bullet entering his brains. Another man of the color party, Ty, snatched up the flag and was likewise cut down. Sergeant Major William F. Willis of Charleston seized the flag. A well-placed shot laid him low as well. Now the line faltered, and we fell back. In the terrible confusion of the moment, we realized not that the colors had been left on the field in Willis's hands. Noticing this, the men shouted up, "We've lost our flag! We've lost our flag!" Panic struck and carried throughout the line. I called for volunteers to rescue the colors. "Boys, who's with me?" Corporal Nathaniel Burgess of Plymouth and Private Patrick Muldoon of Boston, they joined me, and the three of us dashed out to get the colors. We ran over an empty ground, and thousands of muskets fired at us. How we survived, I shall never know. We dashed out of the line, the three of us, under the fire. The enemy slackened their fire, though, once we got closer. Out of what? Admiration, perhaps? Willis's hands had a death grip, and poor Burgess was compelled to pry open his fingers to retrieve the silken banner that had completely enveloped his body, as if it were a funerary shroud. We bore off the flag and returned to our lines, still being fired at. But the rebels who had just shot at us mingled their generous cheers with that of our own men. We were noted for our conspicuous bravery, and Burgess was promoted from being an enlisted man to a first lieutenant as soon as a vacancy occurred. Sadly, he would not live long to enjoy the benefits of being an officer. The colors were badly shot and the staff broken in 2 places, but they were still ours. As I've already mentioned, Colonel Barnes was in command of the brigade that day, and on this occasion, the command of the regiment had fallen to me. That terrible assault before Petersburg was my responsibility, and the fight was terrible. We lost 29 officers and men killed. Roughly 1 out of every 3 present for duty that day fell in battle. This was to be my last combat action serving with the 29th, as there were now other plans of which I had not yet become aware. We set in for a siege, and now we invested in the city. We brought up our guns, built bomb-proofs, and mathematically rained death upon the rebels. We waited in our trenches, waiting for movement. On the 2nd of July, 1864, I was detached and assigned to command of the 14th New York Heavy Artillery, their colonel, lieutenant colonel, and 3 majors being absent. The heavy artillery companies had fortified forts along the Atlantic coast and were, in their organization, twice the size of infantry regiments. I remember marching the men down the way, and a battalion of infantrymen said, "What brigade is that?" And we said, "We are no brigade, we are the 14th New York Heavy Artillery." In the War Department's brilliance, it decided to take these men who were told upon their enlistment that they would not be thrown into the field, that they would stay in our forts and fortify them, using the heavy guns to defend our homes against enemy naval excursions. And the War Department decided to take them out of those fortresses, issue them infantry gear and weapons, and use them in that manner. The 14th New York had already sustained terrible losses when I was put in command of that regiment, and had already made a name for themselves in a short matter of time as brave and resolute boys, even if they were from New York. Having spent the earlier part of the war manning these forts, they had to learn very quickly. And they became fine soldiers, some of the finest men I had ever served with. They had excellent men and junior officers and were without any commanders. I was honored. It was regarded as a great compliment to serve in command of that regiment, that I would be chosen amongst all the able officers in the corps and the division in the brigade to take command of this excellent group of soldiers. Lizzie was especially proud when she received the news. My brother officers regarded it as a well-deserved mark of respect, but were sad to see me go, as was I sad to see them go. I was also informed that with this command I would soon be made a full colonel, skipping the intermediate grade of lieutenant colonel, and be given the full powers of command. Whether over the 29th or the 14th was not yet told to me, and so I would have to wait as I awaited my commission. For the remainder of the campaign, I was able to observe the actions and the going-abouts of my comrades in the 29th. They had been ordered by General Ledlie to charge into that awful carnage called the Crater. an explosion under Petersburg, which created a horrible, horrible hole in the ground. And the men were sent charging headlong into that ground, and the rebels shot them like fish in a barrel. And the brave African-American soldiers inside, along with the white soldiers, were slaughtered down by the rebels. And by the time men tried to retreat, it was too late. It was a debacle. General Ledlie was found drunk behind a haystack, cowering. He was soon cashiered. The waste of life, the waste of great men from the 29th and those other regiments was criminal negligence. No doubt you have heard of the Battle of the Crater, one of the worst episodes in the annals of modern warfare. And even in the face of that incompetence and the lack of leadership of that drunkard Ledlie, our boys fought bravely. Several were cut down and severely wounded. And that was the last time I saw the 29th. They dug into battery number 11 on the line, and to my knowledge, they were there all summer. The 14th New York Heavies held our section of the line for almost a month with little movement. Men would keep low in the trench line. Only a very brave or foolish man would peek up over the parapet and risk being laid low by a rebel sharpshooter. I tried explaining it to those back home and even drew a diagram. I picked up my pen and I wrote to Lizzie. July 25th, 1864, you will see, Lizzie, that men in trenches can protect themselves against bullets and common artillery. But a mortar shell, that can be dropped right into our works. I wrote to Lizzie frequently, and she would write back. It is remarkable how quickly the post would arrive and often get our letters to and fro. It is an amazing modern age we live in. At about 3:45 on August 7th, I sat to pen what would be my last letter. August 7th. My dearest Lizzie, I am sorry that I have not had a chance to write since my last letter. I now have a moment to take up my pen and write to you today. All is quiet along the line at this time. The men are in good health, and in spite of our inactivity, of forward movement, they are in good spirits. The weather is fair today, a break in the heat, finally. How are the children? Sarah must be growing by the day. I heard the distinct shriek of incoming artillery. Perhaps mortar fire. It sounds too close. The enemy had indeed opened fire. It was practically upon us. It's on the heavily occupied part of the line. My boys are being attacked! I came out of my tent, grabbed my sword belt and my sword. The sergeants had already closed up the line, and the men were being pushed into position. The captains already forming into line of battle. Columns of companies moving straight towards... No! Back off from that parapet! Move over there to the redoubt! The shrieking grew louder and closer. Even in the times of greatest peril, I have always found myself to be closest to the line, not far back, not behind, not taking the privilege of an officer, but out with my men. I had to personally lead this reorganization and get the men to cover. Reposition that company, Captain! Move over to the redoubt! Move the battalion to that salient! The shriek grew louder, closer, more shrill. A blinding flash. Darkness. Silence. I cannot feel. Death? William H. Osborne tells us that while engaged in his duty, Major Charles Chipman was mortally wounded by a fragment of a large mortar shell which exploded near him. The concussion and fracture to his skull resulted in a mortal wound. From the time of his wounding till 11 o'clock the next forenoon, he lingered, apparently unconscious, when life became extinct. He was 34 years old. Carefully embalmed, Major Chipman was returned home to Sandwich, where he was received by a heartbroken Lizzie and his 2 children, and many sorrowing neighbors and friends. The burial services began at the Unitarian Church on Main Street. Flags were lowered and flown to half-mast. It took more than an hour for the mourners to file past his casket. The procession walked down Main Street to Freeman Cemetery, where he was buried. Thank you.